The Honourable Fulgoff.
Speaker, there's a deep irony today in the fact that this government will seek to pass this legislation on the votes of two discredited and temporary MPs. One has just resumed his speech after speaking to this House. That man is the man that went to meet Kim.com. He forgot about Kim.com. He's a man easily overlooked. He forgot about the giraffe. He forgot about the hippopotamus. He forgot about the biggest mansion in New Zealand. And he forgot about the helicopter ride that took him there. But most importantly, Mr. Speaker, he forgot about the fact that he went to Kim.com and asked for $50,000 in two cheques of $25,000 each, and then declared the donation anonymous. That wasn't true, Mr. Speaker. That was a lie, and everybody in this House knows that was a lie. And that man comes into this House to support a piece of legislation that fails to get a consensus of support in this House and fails to get a consensus of support across New Zealand. Now, the other vote that the National Government relies on is Peter Dunn. 2 weeks ago, I heard Peter Dunn on radio say, without qualification, I will not support a piece of legislation that gives the GCSB the right to spy on New Zealanders. Without qualification, he said, I will not support that legislation. And a week ago he said, well, there was a willing buyer and a willing seller. I wonder what the price was. What embassy was it? Yet another political appointment that Peter Dunn will go on because he sold his soul. He did exactly what he promised 2 weeks ago he wouldn't do. And that man was sacked as a cabinet minister because he broke the oath of office as a minister that he would not disclose the cabinet papers of his own government. That's who the government relies on to get this legislation through. It doesn't rely on the support of ordinary New Zealanders. You know, we had a poll, didn't we? Television 3, and it found that 40% of New Zealanders didn't have trust and confidence in the GCSB. That is unprecedented. 40% of New Zealanders had lost faith in the organisation that this government is now extending the powers to spy on ordinary New Zealanders. And we heard a lot of cant about the failure to get a consensus and why Labor wasn't supporting. It wasn't through lack of goodwill. This Labor Party accepts that we need to have intelligence agencies, accepts that there are threats in the world, cybersecurity threats, threats to our economy, threats potentially from terrorists. What it doesn't accept is that this piece of legislation is being passed in a way and with a content that protects the other rights of New Zealanders, the right to freedoms and privacy. And I challenge the National Party and the next speaker that gets on his or her feet to say why it is that the key agencies of government that are our watchdogs to protect those rights and freedoms have all come out against this legislation. The Privacy Commissioner, a former Secretary of Cabinet, a woman that you can absolutely rely on, said this legislation must not go through. It needs an inquiry, an independent inquiry, before we give these extra rights to that agency. And we had the Human Rights Commission, not full of trendy lefties appointed by this government, full of people appointed politically by that government, and they said this legislation should not pass. They said it lacks adequate oversight. It makes inadequate provision for ensuring appropriate transparency and accountability of those who administer the legislation. It does not provide for a legal regime containing sufficient safeguards against abuse of power and to facilitate a proportionate approach. That from an agency, the Human Rights Commission, appointed by that government. There is no consensus in New Zealand for this. There is no consensus in this Parliament for this. This government is relying on two discredited MPs to pass legislation that we should be extraordinarily cautious about. We are giving powers to an agency that is not subject to the normal scrutiny by the media or by Parliament because it acts in secret. And we have the core submissioners saying on this legislation it's been rushed, it was introduced under urgency, we haven't had time to prepare submissions on it. This is legislation that should have been taken in time. This is legislation that should have followed a full and independent inquiry into not just the GCSB, but in fact all of our security agencies. That's how you do it. That's how the Australians do it. They do it regularly. You have a full public independent inquiry and you base your legislation on what that inquiry shows. This government has rushed the legislation through. This government has rushed it through to cover its tracks and its own failures, incompetencies and inadequacies. What New Zealander believes that John Key has done his job in placing the GCSB under his proper scrutiny? I know that Helen Clark did. She was there till 1 in the morning doing a job. This man hasn't done his job. This man claimed not to have ever heard of Kim.com, despite the fact he had the biggest house in his own electorate. This man claimed that he'd never been briefed by the GCSB on .com, and that was not true, and it was proven untrue. This man said that he didn't know about the illegality of the GCSB spying until 7 months later. He did. It's inconceivable that he didn't know about it. And this man, John Key, said that he didn't know that his deputy leader and acting Prime Minister at the time, Bill English, had suppressed the ability of the court to know about what the GCSB had done. Never been done in history of this Parliament and under our Constitution before, and he claims Bill English never briefed him. This man says that he has nothing to do with spying on journalists, not what Andrea Vance thinks. She says that that lacks credibility. John Key claims a cock-up over conspiracy. Forgive me if those assurances ring hollow. This from a member of our parliamentary press gallery. This person is simply covering up. This person cannot be relied on to exercise the proper scrutiny over our spy agencies, and that is even more reason why we need legislation that will work even when we don't have a Prime Minister who can be bothered doing his job of oversight. This legislation before us, Mr. Speaker, does not do the job. It is inadequate. It does not provide us with confidence in what will happen. You know, we even had a former head of the Prime Minister and Cabinet's department, David McDowell, who saw the legislation with its proposed changes and said, this won't do. This is a man with inside information who said this legislation does not provide the protections or the assurances that we properly have scrutiny over an agency that we are giving extraordinary powers to. He's not a trendy lefty. He's not a wild radical. He's a lifetime professional, retired now, civil servant, just as Marie Schroff is. The two people who have better inside information than anybody else make a lie of the claims that are made by the government about the protections provided for this bill. This bill does not have the confidence of New Zealanders. This bill will scrape through on the votes of discredited members of Parliament. And I want to say disgraced members of Parliament, both of them, disgraced members of Parliament. I want to say this last thing. You know, if the Prime Minister was interested in independent scrutiny over the GCSB, he would have followed a proper appointment process in appointing the man that's director of it. He failed to tell the country that this man was a personal friend. He followed a process that the State Services Commissioner did not approve of. This is a man that takes shortcuts. This is a man that looks after his own. This is a man who would misuse power. And he's saying, believe me, this is for your own good. We live in an age, Mr Speaker, and I'll finish on this point, where we have seen the abuse of power by security agencies, the NSA and the GCSB in the UK and the US. It can't happen here.
Call giraffe level.
Tēnā koe, Mr Speaker, kia ora tātou katoa. Can I start by saying that the Māori Party will not be supporting